So we've previously taken a look at the concept of sinification as it relates to how it began, which was the tribute system, and then how Chinese traditions affected Korea and Vietnam. In this case, we're going to take a little bit closer look at the island nation of Japan. And Japan became known to the Chinese as the land of the rising sun because, as the Chinese put it, this country is situated near the place where the sun rises. Now, the capital of Heian, or modern-day Kyoto, was actually modeled after the Tang capital of Chang'an. So we've already seen that Korea modeled their capital after Chang'an, and so too do the Japanese. Do the same thing. Now, the Minamoto clan, Minamoto, assumed control in 1185. So right around the start of our time frame, that's when they assume control, after about a period of 3 decades of fighting between clans. They establish, or they install, we could say, a shogun. All right, they install a shogun in place of the emperor. And as we'll see, the shogun is a political leader. It's a military leader. So with this Kamakura shogunate, the shogun assumes true control. Now, for most of the rest of Chinese history, so really ever since the beginning of our time frame, this really relegates the role of the emperor to that of a figurehead who still reigns, but he really is in seclusion in Kyoto, while the true military and political power is indeed held by the shogun. Now, this notion of the bakufu will also be in Japan from about the start of this time frame until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Bakufu loosely translates to tent government. Now, the imperial court is in Kyoto. Eventually, it does move to Edo, modern-day Tokyo. And the imperial court continued to exist and carry cultural importance, but the militarization of Japan will place power in the hands of a hereditary general. And before this, the shogun was purely military and reported to the imperial court. But now they also assume political powers. This is really going to confuse Europeans when they first show up in Japan because they're only going to deal with the shogun. So they're going to assume that the shogun is the emperor, which is not the case. Due to a lack of unification amongst Japanese clans and Japanese regions, mainly because a lot of the terrain is mountainous, hard to travel overland, there aren't a lot of inland rivers. A feudal system is going to reemerge in Japan. Local lords are very powerful, and you can see the breakdown here. Local lords, daimyos, are very powerful, and samurai are going to be beholden to these local lords. What you can see here with merchants at the very bottom, it's pretty similar to China in that they derive from Confucian ideals. So we can see cultural borrowing that's taking place. And the samurai were initially hired to protect wealthy landowners who were shut out of power by the Fujiwara clan. And the Fujiwara clan was in power before the Minamoto. Many samurai had been hired to chase the native Japanese peoples, the Ainu, onto the northernmost island of Hokkaido. Now, once that was finished, these warriors kind of terrorized the countryside. So they needed something to do. Samurai translates to serve. So they worked for local leaders. Their wealth was measured in the amount of rice they had, and eventually all samurai will receive a yearly rice stipend. Now, over time, the samurai will develop a unique code that comes to be known as Bushido, or Way of the Warrior. These samurai, these warriors, are supposed to be brave, loyal, and have honor. They need to have superior martial arts skill and choose death over surrender. Now, according to one Chinese scholar, the educated men of the land regard the carrying of arms as a disgrace. Now, this is where the Japanese will divert from the Chinese in their preference for bearing arms. But we sort of see how Japan borrows socially from China, but then kind of goes their own way. Now, the Kamakura shogunate. So the Minamoto clan sets up the Kamakura shogunate. It will end in 1338, when a years-long civil war ended up destroying the system. The Ashikaga shogunate will end up assuming control in Kyoto. And this will set off an era when provincial warlords will enjoy even more independence. So feudalism will increase. Now, this is also the era when imposing castles were built. So if you have this image in your mind of traditional Japanese castles, this is where it comes from. Surrounding their castles, they would sponsor markets and religious institutions and schools, while earlier technological importations will increase agricultural output. Now, this increased competition will lead to what we call the Warring States period. And the Warring States actually more extend into our next era, our next time frame, the mid-1450s through the early 1600s. By and large, most movies that depict a romantic version of Japan with the samurai, most of them are from this time frame. Now, in Japan, there's a tradition known as Shinto, traditional belief systems based on the kami, which are sacred spirits associated with human ancestors and natural elements. This later becomes referred to as Shinto, and it helps the ruling family legitimize their power by declaring that they descended from the sun gods. So we've seen in China that there's a mandate of heaven where the ruling family gets their power from the gods. So too in Japan does the ruling family get their power only from the sun gods. Now, Shinto is practiced currently by about 80% of the population, and there's about 81,000 temples and 85,000 priests. But it's viewed as somewhat secular because there's really not a ritual involved with becoming Shinto. And the traditions are tied to Japan itself. So many Japanese simply carry it on. This doesn't really conflict with Buddhism because there's not really ritual, there's not a formality. It's just very well integrated into Japanese life. Now, the previous Fujiwara clan favored learned Confucian scholars over illiterate warriors. Thus, the noblemen of the era read Chinese classics and they appreciated painting and poetry. Education for women was not directly encouraged. So we're seeing Confucian elements, Confucian influences. Education wasn't encouraged necessarily, and noble women were forced to live in near total isolation, where they studied Buddhism and other cultural pursuits. To communicate with their families, they depended on writing letters using a simplified script that reflected the fully inflected form of the Japanese language. Meanwhile, the men wrote in Chinese script. So men and women even write differently. Unique Japanese writing system is going to develop, combining Chinese characters and phonetic sounds. And, using these ideas with the learned, educated classes, court officials and ladies will live pretty well and compose poetry. Now, our knowledge of the time period becomes, it kind of comes to us courtesy of female writers. Female writers who wrote in Japanese script rather than the Chinese favored by men. The Tale of the Genji, one of the first novels published in human history. It actually paints a picture of the romances of court life. really the romances of court life. And interestingly enough, Japanese women at the elite level will maintain somewhat of a specific level of independence. And it's probably because they interacted with the Chinese during the Tang, when we've already seen that women had more freedom. By and large, Japanese women could inherit property. They could marry and divorce who they wanted, and married couples would actually live either apart or with the wife's family. Their loss of power beginning in the 12th century is more related to a rise in the warrior culture. And samurai would form relationships with local lords, and this replaces marriage as a political strategy. And we finally see the influence of Buddhism, but we know it as Zen Buddhism as part of the Japanese tradition. It's this fusing of Chinese and Japanese traditions. So in Japan, we see a bit more of an independent streak going along with the Sinification that really occurs beginning with the Tang Dynasty.